Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Town Hall Europe, the conference centre of Friends of Europe here in Brussels, Belgium. I'm Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow here at Friends of Europe, and it's my great pleasure this evening, to moderate our debate on Going It Alone Does Not Work. I suppose many of you would think that a couple of years ago that would have been a very redundant title, yes, because it's obvious to all of us just 10 years ago that Going It Alone could not possibly work. So why would we be debating that this evening? Well, I suppose, as Bob Dylan put it 50 years ago, the times they are changing. We've had over the last decades a number of massive shocks to the global order as I certainly grew up to get to know it. We've had the financial crisis, we've had the advent of climate change, we've had the return to great power rivalries and competition, we've had countries putting themselves first, second and third in the international system too. And now, of course, 4 years of the administration of Donald Trump and the questioning of multilateralism, the questioning of alliances, the questioning of the wisdom of engaging in an order where, as John F. Kennedy once put it, a rising tide lifts all boats. But does the rising tide these days, if there is such a thing, lift all boats? Or is it more a question of winner takes all? You're either with me or you are against me, and beggar thy neighbour in economic relations. These are the questions that I want to elucidate tonight, just to see if the world is really changing in a fundamental way, or if somehow we can rescue something from all of this in terms of getting back to multilateralism, to growth and global cooperation, as I think many of us would like to see. Now, to debate these truly geostrategic questions, I have three of the very best with me tonight. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Joseph Nye from Harvard University. I think that I won't be unduly flattering Joe if I would say that he's probably the best known scholar of international relations from the United States around today. He's been Dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard. He's been the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs in the Pentagon and Chairman of the National Intelligence Council. And nobody is better known for having meditated the theme of power in all its manifestations and what it means today. If you have it, how can you use it? And if you don't have it, how can you get it back? I'm also delighted to welcome to our debate this evening Baroness Valerie Amos, who has been a distinguished member of the Cabinet in British governments, as Secretary of State for International Development. She was leader of the House of Lords. Then she went off to the international domain, serving as the Under-Secretary of the United Nations for Humanitarian Affairs. And now she is Master of University College, Oxford, and I'm delighted that she's at that university rather than what we call in the UK the other place. And then finally, from Beijing, we have Huiyao, and I'll call him Henry because that's how he's known in the Anglo-Saxon world, at least. Wang, he is at the helm of one of the most leading think tanks in China. He's also an advisor to the government, to the State Council, and he has been an advisor also to the World Bank and many other international bodies as well. He's one of China's foremost economic strategists and thinkers. So thank you, all three of you, for joining me this evening. I'd like to structure our debate around four, to my mind at least, key questions. The first one, and I mentioned it, is this business of what is power today and who has it, who is losing it, if they're losing it, can they regain it, and how is power best used both for one's own national interest, but also to secure the wider benefit of the global community. We debated here just a couple of nights ago what strategic autonomy means for the European Union as it tries to reposition itself in the world. But what does power, what does leverage, what does agency mean for the US today, for Beijing, but also for the rest of the world, for all of those other countries, particularly in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, who also have a voice and a key interest in this area. Number two, is globalization now over? Or is multilateralism dead as we knew it? What's still left? And what can we resurrect when we start thinking of recovering and rebounding back? Thirdly, how can we prevent, particularly as COVID now seems to be endless with a massive economic impact, how can we prevent the great slide backwards? I was very alarmed just a few months ago to read a World Bank report that 60 million people could be pushed back into poverty as the result of the economic losses from the pandemic. I saw something from the IMF the other day that suggested a whole of $21 trillion lost revenue of the global economy if COVID goes on into 2021 and 2022. These are horrendous figures. So how can we at least limit the damage here, particularly to the poorer people, the less advantaged people in what we used to call the third world or the developing countries? And finally, it's very easy sometimes to sort of lapse into complete pessimism and gloom and doom when you see what's going wrong with the world today. But of course, the gifted statesmen and women, the gifted policymakers are looking for opportunities and chances to at least turn the world when it does start to recover in a more positive direction. So is that possible? And where would my three panelists this evening believe the opportunities, that silver lining in the cloud truly lies? So I invite all of you participating this evening, familiar of course with these Zoom meetings. You've all done at least 2,000 individually already since we went into lockdown last spring. So you know the routine. Put your hand up. Please use the chat and write your question and write comments, not just questions, please comments too, because that way we can record everything that you're saying, get back to you later, or keep it as part of our report on the debate. And I'll try as we go along to bring as many of you in as possible. When I do bring you in, if you can keep your comments short, that helps. And if you can indicate to who you want to address your comment or question, that helps as well. So, Joe, first of all, I wanted to turn to you and ask you first to comment on how do you believe the international order how dependent is that international order still on US leadership? We're all bemoaning the absence of US leadership. Do you think the international system can function constructively without it? Can it prosper without the US as the leader? And what kind of power could the US still bring to bear on the issues we face today? Joe, it's great to see you. Thank you for patiently waiting. But now, finally, I could turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Jamie. And basically, I think what we know is that if the largest country in the international system doesn't help to take the lead in providing global public goods, it's very hard for others to do so. This was the great flaw that the United States suffered back in 1930s. Where you saw that the Americans had become the largest country, but they turned inward to isolation. And after World War II, people like Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower realized you couldn't go back with that. And they created what's sometimes been called the liberal international order. And that basically, with all its flaws and faults, nonetheless has allowed enormous stability and prosperity for the last half century or even 70 years or so. It's now under threat. I think the threat some people focus on is the rise of China. To me, I've written I'm worried less about the rise of China than the rise of Trump. And by the rise of Trump, I mean the rise of nationalist populism in democracies. Will we return to something like the 1930s where the Americans will still have preponderant military power resources and still impressive economic power resources, and also soft power, the ability to get what you want through attraction. The danger is whether we're going to squander our soft power by having too narrow a definition of our national interest and also fail to provide the leadership that a large country has to have. We're going to have to share that leadership with others, including China. But what worries me is that we won't live up to the responsibility. So finally, just to summarize this, in my latest book, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, I say we're going to have to distinguish between power over others and power with others. Because when you're dealing with something like global climate change or the COVID pandemic, there's no way any country, whether it's the US, China, Europe, anybody, can solve it alone. It has to be done cooperatively. No, that's the power with others. And I worry that we're going to focus so much on power over others in the competitive parts of the relationship that we neglect the power with others. So those are the dimensions, I think, of how we need to think about the question you asked me.
Joe, thanks very much. I'd like to follow up with a second question, if I may. Two parts. So on the one hand, you mentioned the Trump factor, which of course has had a major impact. But if there were a change of administration next January, obviously you could have a new mood music, a new rhetoric, a different type of language coming out of Washington. But how easy would it be for the United States in terms of economy, in terms of politics, in terms of the evolution of American society, simply to sort of step back into that leadership role that it played for so many years? Are the fundamentals still all in place, or, notwithstanding Trump, have things changed, which means that the US will inevitably play a lesser role? And secondly, how do you sort of rate the capacity of Beijing or the European Union to sort of share the burden of global leadership with the United States? What would you be telling, for example, all of us in Brussels around the European Union that we should be doing maybe to better fill some of that vacuum? Sorry for some complicated questions, Joe, but you're the only one I know who can answer them.
Well, there's some good news to report, which is the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which does a poll every 2 years about American attitudes of willingness to be involved internationally, shows that 70% of Americans want an outward-looking cooperative foreign policy. That's good news. It means the capacity to have a more cooperative policy is there if the election turns out to produce a Biden presidency. Biden has said already that he would rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, that he would not complete the withdrawal that Trump has threatened from the World Health Organization, that we'd reaffirm American alliances and so forth. So I think there is a prospect that you will see a change in American policy if you have a change in the presidency. And I think it will be supported by domestic public opinion for the reasons that I just gave. On the other hand, it still remains the case that the Americans can't do this acting alone, and that's more true than ever. 20 years ago, I wrote a book called The Paradox of American Power, and the subtitle is one you'll be familiar with this week: Why the World's Only Superpower Can't Go It Alone. And if that was true 2 decades ago, it's doubly true now. If you're going to deal with these issues, the global transnational issues, you are going to have to do it with others. The Americans may help to take a lead, but they have to count on China, have to count on Europe, have to count on Japan and other countries if we're going to get anything done in these areas. So in that sense, I think what I'd like to see from the EU is much more of an initiative in terms of moving on some of these questions. Europe is already way ahead on climate change, the Paris Accords, for example. It's also way ahead on some of the issues relating to pandemics and helping with the new facility that the WHO has created, the COVAX facility for distributing vaccines to poor countries. So these are steps in the right direction. I'm glad to see that China has joined the COVAX somewhat belatedly, but they're still ahead of the U.S., where Trump has not joined it. I suspect that the Biden presidency would join it. But the summary of this is that what I said 20 years ago is more true than ever now. The world's only superpower can't go it alone, and that's going to require many more initiatives from countries like China, Japan, and also from entities like the European Union. The stronger Europe gets, the better it is for us.
Joe, thanks very much for now. Of course, you'll come back in just a moment when we get into the discussion. I'm going to turn to Valerie. Valerie, the question I'd like to put to you is, how do you see the consequences for the rest of the world of this sort of clash of the titans, particularly in the trade area that we've seen between the US and China in recent times? What are the consequences, you think, for Africa, Asia, places that you know very well indeed from your experience dealing with development, the consequences for these populations of markets closing, tariffs going up, for instance, maybe the impact of COVID on what we'll be able to spend on development aid in the future. And do you think that the rest of the world is having a voice at all in this ongoing discussion?
Well, Jamie, thank you very much. And that's quite a series of questions there that
But I know that, again, you can answer them.
that follow on pretty neatly, I think, from some of what Joe just said. So I think a couple of things just by way of introduction to link to Joe. One is that the pandemic has shown us very, very clearly that you can't distinguish between borders. And I think that there is something about that connectivity that means that regardless of the kind of protectionism that you're seeing now, not just from the United States, but from elsewhere, that it will just not be able to continue, that conditions will actually force a pace of change. The direction of that, I think, is going to be the big challenge. What are the implications of that, for example, for the African continent or indeed for other countries? So let me just focus on countries on the African continent for a moment. So those countries, of course, have a major trading relationship with the United States. If you think about it, there are 44 sub-Saharan African countries which are part of AGOA, the special relationships with the United States. And in a way, you could argue that the fact that the Trump administration actually has not made Africa a priority is in those countries' interests, because that arrangement has not been challenged. African countries also have major trade relationships with the EU, and also, of course, with China. So what increasing protectionism or putting up of trade barriers within the United States has done for those countries means that they have to look elsewhere. And given that they already have those strong relationships with China and the EU, they are likely to look there. But I do think that there are some challenges that those countries themselves have in terms of being able to maximize the opportunities that exist. There are major challenges around productivity, around the ease of doing business in those countries. I sit on the board of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and we have an index that looks at this on an annual basis, and you will see that year on year, the removal of those barriers to doing business is indeed extremely slow. These are countries that need to diversify their economic structures. They need to diversify their trade partners. They need to diversify their investment sources. So I think that there are opportunities there, but I also think that if the countries themselves don't change, don't take advantage of those opportunities. And we're seeing that partly through the African Union continental opening up in terms of trade. We're seeing the push, the ongoing push for the regional trade blocs on the African continent, but there would have to be a great deal more progress for those opportunities to be fully grasped.
Valerie, thanks for that. And I also appreciate you giving us some sort of positive avenues, things that we can do better, and which to my mind, the audience will comment too, sound highly sort of realistic and feasible. But a follow-up question, if I may. I mean, you're not any longer a senior UN official, but you were comparatively recently, and you know the UN very well. And therefore, I wanted to ask you, when looking at all of the issues that you've been interested in, that you're dealing with, do you think the UN is stepping up to the plate? Is it really sort of playing the role that it should be playing in dealing with the current crisis? Is it providing the leadership, the initiatives, or do you think there is a danger that the UN is being a little bit sidelined in all of this, and perhaps regional organisations are now the things that we have to look at to sort of deliver the ideas and the solutions? So, how do you think your old organisation is sort of faring?
I think it's very hard for the UN to, as it were, step up to the plate in terms of the current geopolitical context, given, for example, the damage that's being done to the World Health Organization as a result of the threats from the United States, what we're seeing on the human rights side with the countries that are due to join the Human Rights Council, the fact that the UN Security Council has been almost absent in terms of any kind of discussion of the COVID pandemic and the impact. This is a major crisis for the world. It's not just a health crisis, it's also an economic crisis. And yet the Security Council, which is meant to consider these global issues which have an impact on security across the world, is not looking at these issues. But I do think that there are also some opportunities in this. I don't think that those are necessarily opportunities that are being pushed at the level of the state. I think the response at the level of the state has been piecemeal, and it's been very much about countries coming up with their own strategies despite the push from the WHO. But I do think that if you look at what some of the other players are doing, so for example, the fundraising efforts of something like the UN Foundation with the World Health Organization, the Gates Foundation, and others, there are others that are stepping into this space. The importance of academia, the research that we are seeing in Oxford and elsewhere, the sharing of data to get us to the point where we will get a vaccine. I think that the vacuum that has been created as a result of multilateral organizations being under threat has again opened up a space that others have stepped into. How we then use that as citizens, the connectivity that we are seeing between people across countries, the communication on these issues, how we can tap into that and, as it were, tap into a third sector through the kind of engagement we're seeing on climate change, on Black Lives Matter, the kind of activism around that. I think that's our challenge for the future.
Valerie, thanks a lot. So a new multilateralism is coming up more from the grassroots level of the expert scientific academic community. Vaccine research is a very good case in point. So thank you. Let's first of all thank Tonu, our in-house cartoonist this week, for giving his take on events, which you can either agree with or disagree with, but certainly it's an interesting perspective. I mentioned that this is going to be interactive, so I'm going to ask Henry Wang in Beijing just to hold fire for a few moments because two people would like to come in already. David Anderman wants to come in, and Jacob, if I've got it right, Zientala. But David, please then unmute yourself and make your comment or ask your question.
Well, this was originally for Joe, but actually, any of the three of you could have something to say about it. One of the things that concerns me is whether the Trump administration in its final days, hopefully its final days, will be in a position to lock in some international affairs priorities that will be more difficult for a Biden administration to unwind, or for the United States to unwind, especially if Trump, in remote cases, actually able to win re-election. One of these, of course, is Afghanistan, and I've just learned just a few moments ago by an email that Trump may be preparing a major foreign policy address dealing with Afghanistan, in which he really will this time suggest a concrete number of how many troops the United States is going to withdraw. At any rate, I think this is really very dismaying. It's kind of the many of the issues that I deal with in my new book, A Red Line in the Sand. I encourage you to have a look at it. Self-promotion.
Oh yeah, but, always good to plug your latest book, David.
Well,
but David, I'm also going to ask you to keep it short, David, if you don't mind, because
that's all.
I know that's great.
I would really be interested in hearing Joe's or the other the Baroness's or Henry's concept of whether they are concerned that we are getting in a position where the United States will be locked in some fashion by Trump in his last throes, if you will, to issues that will be more difficult to unwind.
Yep, the issue of how much is sort of irreversible, or at least difficult to reverse. Okay, we'll get to that, but before we do, just to think it's going to be a better use of our time, Jacob, would you like also to come in on this round with your comment or question, and then I'll go to our panel. Jacob, please.
Yeah, sure. I have just a short remark, because generally I am pretty much a discutant who is representing Generation Y. So we are entering our stages of first stages of career. And what I see very problematic, that is for my generation, is that role of Europe is diminishing in world. And despite that, we are relatively engaged as young citizens, because Generation Y and Generation Z has probably some of the highest involvement among young
Jacob, I think we're losing the sound here.
Can
we hear you? Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes, better now.
So
but it's best to make your comment quickly, if you don't mind, because we may lose you again, and we don't want to lose your comment.
Okay. So I was saying that we need somebody who is competent in Brussels, who will match the vision and expectations of the people that we have as Europeans. But sadly, there is nobody in the current system that would offer this sort of thing. And with US gone, we have nothing really to count on in terms of close allies. That's it.
Well, Jacob, for a young person, that sounds a little bit on the gloomy side. Would the panelists agree that we don't really have the leadership we need, not just we look at the US, but in Europe or elsewhere? Or do we have the leaders, and maybe we don't appreciate them or what they're doing perhaps as much as we should? We're maybe a little bit too cynical. What do the panelists think? Joe first, irreversibility coming out of the Trump administration. Do you sort of share David's worry on that score? Joe, unmute.
David raises an important point. I don't think we're at a stage of irreversibility. I think, in fact, we can repair most of what Trump has done. As a European friend of mine said to me a year or two ago, we can hold our breath for 4 years. I'm not sure we can hold it for 8 years. I think we're still at that 4-year mark. On the question of leadership in Europe, I was a bit worried at the beginning of the pandemic that Europe, which when it acts as an entity, is an economy the scale of the US and larger than China, was not acting as an entity, which is a classic problem. But I thought my worry or pessimism was reprieved a bit when Merkel and Macron agreed on a plan to take the costs, the fiscal costs of the responses to the virus, and to share them on a Europe-wide basis. I thought that was real leadership and a very important step for Europe moving in the right direction. So I'm not quite as pessimistic as I might have been 6 months ago.
That's good to hear. Henry, you're going to make your comments in a moment, but from a Chinese perspective, is it true that the Chinese people perhaps have more confidence and faith in their leadership than maybe we seem to have here in Europe or in the United States? How do the Chinese people perceive the quality of the leadership in dealing with current issues?
Thank you, James, for the question. I think that the U.S. now we are seeing the election coming up. I think either Biden or Trump is making their best efforts now, and but looks like Biden's leading. But I was wondering, if President Trump is going to continue. But if he's continue, I think he probably will do phase 2, phase 3 with China. He will try to still pursue unilateralism. But if Biden comes up, I think he probably will pursue more multilateral approach. He will go back to Paris Accord. He will resume the WHO, and then he probably will reform WTO, and probably even come back to CPTPP. So I think there will be more channels to talk on a bilateral basis with Biden coming up, I think.
Well, thanks, Harry. Jacob, it looks like our panelists are slightly more optimistic about leaders than maybe you are. But Valerie, you're now master of an Oxford college, which means to say that you must see lots and lots of students, young people thinking about their role in the world, their prospects, job prospects for the future. Oxford, of course, is one of the top universities, and it may be easier for students there than elsewhere. But do you find, difficult, I know, to give us a straw poll, but do you find that they share Jacob's sort of gloom or sense of gloom or pessimism about Generation Y, as he called it?
Jamie, so I think I'd like to say three things. First, in relation to leadership, I think there is a certain gloominess about the quality of global leadership. But my take on that is it depends on where we are looking for the leadership. And I think that we have been inspired, many of us, by the young people who have been leading global movements around the world. And I mentioned a couple of them in my introductory remarks.
Absolutely.
Can I just say two other things really quickly?
You may, yes.
Secondly, I think that there is an issue about traditional modes of organization of our multilateral organizations. And we have not found a way of reforming those organizations that better reflects the modern world. I think that's going to be very slow, but we have to think about ways in which we can perhaps push for that change. The third thing I would say very, very quickly is that whether or not a country is in favor of those multilateral organizations partly depends on what they get out of it. Henry mentioned the WTO. The WTO is an organization where Germany, the United States, and China get the most out of the 144 countries that are members of the WTO, get the most out of it. But every single country that is a member of the WTO benefits in terms of their GDP from that membership, despite the challenges that we have seen in the WTO and the fact that, they've not been really negotiating anything for the last 5 years. I think the last time that they had any meaningful negotiations around the Doha round were in 2015.
Absolutely. Valerie, I'm not going to let you off the hook about your students, though. When you talk to them, do you find a sort of a sense of optimism about the future, a time of great challenges and rushing to get engaged, or do they feel, with obviously some of the gloomy economic news, that maybe they're going to find it harder than maybe their parents? I know I'm asking you to ridiculously overgeneralize, but I'm tempted to ask you the question in response to Jacob.
It's an entirely legitimate question, and there's no one answer. So I think there is a lot of interest in the world. There's a lot of interest in what's going on in the world, a lot of, caring about what their future is going to look like. I think there is also a degree of bleakness about the global economy, what that means in various countries around the world. If I think about the students who are here from the UK, They worry about unemployment. They worry that they're not going to be able to earn enough to have homes in which to buy homes in which to live. So there is a lot of worry and a lot of concern about the lack of global leadership as they see it. What I hope they'll do is step into that void. They are perfectly capable of doing that.
Excellent. Valerie, thanks. Henry, you waited patiently for your initial comments, so I'm turning to you now. And what I did not mention at the beginning, and excuse me, but that the think tank research institute of which you are the founder and president is the Center for China and Glocalization, which certainly suggests that it's very outward looking. Henry, China, of course, has been in the past one of the greatest beneficiaries of globalization. We all know those statistics of the 300 million plus Chinese that were lifted out of poverty because of China's engagement in the global economy. China, of course, has benefited enormously from the global trading system. So my question, in these difficult times, does it see as a rising power a kind of global responsibility to uphold that multilateral system? Or does it believe that we're going to an increasingly me-first type of world in which competition is replacing cooperation? Well, what's your take looking at things from the vantage point of Beijing?
Yeah, thank you, James. I think this is a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed what Professor Nye and also Baroness Amos just exchanged. What the question you raised is really important, and I think we are now just celebrated the 75 years of UN history, and this is the UN multilateral system. US was the leading force on that. China was one of the first charters signatory to the UN. So for the last 75 years, we've been really fortunate enough to avoid big Third World War, but now we're having a worldwide virus war now going on. So it's really very unfortunate. I think we really need to strengthen the multilateral system. China, of course, is one of the biggest beneficiary of a global system, but I think now China wants to uphold that, wants to maintain that, and also wants to support that. I think President Xi not too long ago pledged $2 billion US dollars in supporting COVID fighting with the developing countries, and also climate change is, as we have heard, is also very important global issue now that we need to really face together. And also President Xi mentioned about China had a clear target by 2060. We're going to have a carbon neutral emission by then. So we need a lot of work on that. I think what I published an op-ed on Financial Times actually today and also tomorrow, that I'm saying that for this, no country is an island in terms of in a climate crisis. So I was suggesting that op-ed that maybe we should have a climate summit, that maybe we should build on the G7, but also we need to have India, Russia, China, which actually so that we population from 10% to 47% of the global population, but also the emission. 6 of the G10 are the largest polluters.
It seems like these securities.
So I think that we need to really work on that. So I hope that we need to work together and have this green multilateralism. We probably need a vaccine summit that we need all the countries to work together to have a vaccine and make it a public good. We need to really reform WTO, and China is also interested to join CPTPP. So on the multilateral front, I think there's a lot of things we can do. I remember a few months ago, 2 months ago, we had a dialogue with Joseph, and he mentioned about we should have a world pandemic fund. Maybe US and China can do something on that to really to give some relief to the world. So I think there's many things we can do that to really strengthen the multilateralism, and also we can really look forward to a more tightly dependent. So from mutually assured of a destruction to a mutually assured dependence, that we really need to do that. And China is really trying to do that in that process.
Henry, thanks for that, and thanks also for giving us some good examples of how China is sort of stepping up, particularly financially. I have to ask you a frank question now, but you've probably been asked this before. Over the last couple of years, as China has risen as a power, particularly in the military domain, it's asserted its interests. You may say it's not the only one to assert its interests, but in Europe, I think among many politicians, among citizens too, and not just in the United States, Australia, Japan, other places too, there is a new mood of wariness about China's rise. Is it going to be peaceful? Is China going to be nationalist? What about Taiwan? What about the South China Sea? What about the human rights situation? What about a more aggressive Chinese discourse, in the social media, on the media more generally? And you, somebody who advises the Chinese government, somebody who knows the world in the international system, are you worried sometimes that, maybe China is maneuvering itself into a situation where it's not going to be much loved or much liked, where it will be as much feared as respected? And, what would you sort of tell the Chinese leadership about how it could sort of, maybe project a more positive image in global politics at the moment? Do you think we sort of look at China unfairly? I have to ask you this because I think, for many of us, quo vadis China, what kind of power is it going to be in the 21st century is probably, the number one international question.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie, for that stimulating question. I think, yeah, you're right. A lot of people are really concerned, probably, in the world now. But that's probably, I think there's several reasons for that. Why is that we really need to strengthen the communications on that. And so China is probably opened up for the last 41 years now, and China has been one of the poorer countries now to the second largest economy. I think that's probably, I remember when Larry Summers come to my think tank and give a talk, he was saying that the lifting 800 million people out of poverty is probably one of the greatest transformation in the history of mankind, probably compatible to the Industrial Revolution, 100 or 200 years ago. So I think that the China has been doing really, if you measure country by KPI, China is doing really well with the globalization. China really embraced globalization. For example, China now is the largest trading nation with 130 countries. China has covered itself with 1 billion smartphone users now. I mean, you have 2/3 of speed railway of the world, and also China has covered 1.3 billion people basic Medicare and basic pension. That's incredible. That's something that China has doubled its life expectancy from when China was founded 70 years ago to now. So I think that there's many reasons to probably China didn't really explain well. But on the other hand, China never sent a soldier overseas or conquer any continental countries. I think there's some worries. I think people worry. I think there's some probably legitimate worries, but I don't think that it was really substantially supported. On the other hand, I think China did adopt a different system, which I think that is probably the worry people may have. But on the other hand, as Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter if it's a white cat, black cat, as long as it catches
the proverbial mice, yeah.
Yeah. So if it works well with China, and so it's not the end of history. If China is prosperous, if China contributes 35% of GDP growth to the world, if China is the leading power now, is economic power. For example, World Bank and IMF have just recently upgraded China GDP growth to almost 2%. Yeah. The only major country has a positive growth in the pandemic fighting. China now has no pandemic, no COVID-19 cases. Very few. It's just a handful of that.
It's quite remarkable.
China must, right. So I think that China needs to really explain well. There's a narrative. I think China needs to really have a good narrative and maybe explain well, and using international language and people understanding. There is a communication problem, but I think China benefited enormously with the world system, multilateralism that's set up by the U.S. and the EU and many other Western countries.
Thanks, Henry.
China wants to contribute. wants to contribute.
Henry, thank you for giving such a frank and comprehensive answer on that particular question. We've got, coming in now into the debate, we've got two perspectives from the younger generation, which I always welcome. So I'm going to take two questions again together and then put it to the panel. So we've got Jacopo Cavagna and Virginia Bartiesi, if I've got your names correctly pronounced, but hopefully I was close enough so that you know who I'm talking to. And so Jacopo, please come in first with your question. Or comment.
Yeah, really close. Really close. Thank you.
You're being too polite, but go ahead.
My question is for Professor Nye. This is quite amusing, actually, because I just wrote an essay about you. Anyways, you mentioned that you were scared about the rise of Trump in the US, more than the rise of China as a whole. Data show us that both in the US and in Europe, young people, though not to the same extent of other generation, support discriminatory attitudes, disregard environmental issues, losing trust in science, and so on. So my question is, what do you believe is the key to change this trend? To what extent and how can we, young people, represent a turning point in such a crucial moment for our planet and our living? Thank you.
Okay, Jacopo, thanks very much. And now, Virginia, please, would you like to come in and then we'll go back to the panel?
Yes, I'd love to connect to what Baroness Amos previously said. I think it's extremely important to underline the fact that the multilateral system is changing, and it's changing in a way that young people are stepping in more and more, especially when it comes to talking about international social policy. So I think that probably multilateral institutions, international institutions, should be, to a certain extent, reformed in order to institutionalized youth participation and to make sure that young people really have a say in international decision-making processes. There are steps made in this direction. The UN Youth Envoy is one of those, but I'd love to know if Baroness Amos maybe thinks that there's more that could be done at the UN level, at the EU level, in order to implement this path in including young people in international decision-making processes.
Okay, Virginia, thanks very much. Excellent. So, Joe, the first question from Jacopo was to you. He's written an essay about you, but I won't ask him to send it to you so that you could sort of give him a mark before he submits it to his professor. But instead, no doubt you could answer his question.
Well, if it's as good as his question, you'll get an A. But let me say that I think that I agree very much with what Valerie Amos has said about the young people. The students I see today are really very interested in engaging with public issues, much more so, let's say, than 10 or 15 years ago. I'm struck by the number of young students in school who are working on get out the vote campaigns. Most polls show that there are going to be many more people voting among their age group this year. And they have structured organizations to help other people to vote. So I think there are lots of things where you can see activity by young people, and these are training grounds for when they will rise to even higher levels of authority. And the other area I think that young people make a big difference is social media. More and more people are getting their news and their views, particularly about what's true in science and so forth, on social media. And if your generation does more to try to promote truth and science on social media, that will be a major contribution. So there's a lot more to be said by it, but let me just leave it there.
Joe, thanks very much. Now to Baroness Amos, the question about whether youth are sort of represented in an organizational political sense so that they can be consulted on global affairs, that they can have a voice. When you were at the UN, did you feel that the UN sort of really had structures for sort of engaging with youth as future leaders in a kind of systematic way? The EU was mentioned as well, but do we still have a lag there that somehow we have to make up in terms of giving the successor generation a voice? Valerie, sorry, we have the mute issue. We always have it every time with the mute button.
Thank you. I was saying it's a great question, because whilst there are some UN organizations that have opened up and have, as it were, institutionalized youth participation, I slightly worry about that institutionalization, because just by virtue of that institutionalization, and it is what we have, and it's what we have to work with, I think sometimes the edge of what young people are trying to do gets lost, because they get caught up in how you actually work your way through the bureaucracy. And I think the bigger question for me, in a way, is how do you translate the activism that we have seen out on the street and in other fora into those organizations in a way that retains that dynamism, retains that sense of outside pressure, so that the inside of an organization actually begins to shift and change. So how do you get internal activism as well as the external activism working together to make that change happen? I don't have an easy answer to that. I think the points that were made about social media, for example, are very important there in terms of maintaining that external pressure. But I slightly worry about bureaucratizing and institutionalizing a voice that remains important in terms of really pushing a change agenda.
Okay, thanks. Henry, just a super quick one to you, because I've still got some people who would like to come into the debate. But as we're talking about the role of youth, young people, an organized sort of institutionalized voice, does that exist in China? Does the government have some kind of scheme for consulting young people, or do they have to wait until they're well on into their careers and well on into their lifespan before they can really be considered to be political actors?
Well, there are a lot of young people organizations in China. Of course, there are 3,000 universities in China, and there's we have Bill Gates Foundation is here. We got a lot of NGOs working. We have Return the Scholar Association. So you're right. I mean, now China is really now developing the digital economy. Digital economy accounts 36% of China's GDP now, and accounts 50% of Beijing, Shanghai's GDP. So young people, with the phones and the apps and whatever, they are really live and transform China. And the digital economy also support China through this COVID-19 era. But also, I think that we need more dialogue. And I see that China has launched the Great Bay for Guangdong, Hong Kong, and Macau, and they want to attract Hong Kong young people to work in the Great Bay Area, so as cheaper apartments, better job opportunities, and development opportunities, and even settle down there. So that maybe relieve some of the problem that the Hong Kong young people may feel frustrated in Hong Kong for their career opportunities. So I think there are concerns about young people, and young people are really. I agree with Joe. Are really active these days, and more lively, and with probably 10, 20 years ago. And we have, particularly with the digital economy, with the internet, with the smartphone. So the smartphone generation, I think that really make a huge difference. They basically read every day, on their 10 hours on their mobile phone.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks. And it's always good to have somebody from Beijing who can actually give us that perspective with some good concrete examples from the ground. We've still got some people wanting to come in. We don't have much time left, so I'm going to take 3 in a row, and then we'll see where those comments and questions go in terms of our panel. Monica Sanders is first. Then we've got Diego, I think I read here, Diego Malado from the EU in Peru. So that's a long way away, Diego. Good you've joined us today. And then Gianpaolo Silvestri from the AVSI Foundation. So Monica, please, you're first. Go ahead.
Absolutely, thank you. My name is Monica Sanders. I am a professor at Georgetown University. I teach hazard economics, so I've been thinking about this pandemic quite a bit. I want to appreciate the conversation reflecting on the role of youth as well as acknowledging some of the global movements led by youth that we're talking about. And I would like to ask the panelists to further comment on this, including an article I read in preparation for this from Gilles Merritt about reigniting the G20. And should we be thinking about reframing and rethinking not just the G20, but how we approach multilateralism? Because what we've learned during COVID-19 is our historical structures aren't working in light of changing demography. Demography is the most prevalent of which is youth versus aging populations in some of our country, as well as the issue of poverty that is globally pervasive and needs to be thought through in a multilateral way. So how do we rethink and reframe how we think about power and who's included in power structures going forward?
Okay, well, Monica, you ask all of what we used to call the $64,000 questions there. So thank you, and thanks for referring to Giles's article. He would be very honored to know that you read that. Diego, now please, your turn.
Yes, hello here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Diego Mellado. I'm the European Union ambassador here in Peru, actually. I'm talking from Lima, from the, as you said, very far away from Europe. I mean, I'm talking from the shores of the Atlantic, of the Pacific
But we're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much. But my comment is about the appeal and the impact of the European narrative. And this is something I've seen in full evolution. I've been here more than 3 years now in this country. And now in the COVID, in the pandemic times, I see that we have a stronger appeal as European Union. I think that we are offering solutions, or at least an avenue in a number of key areas like climate change, like relation with China, where there's a lot of confusion in the world, and the European Union proposal for engagement, cooperation with China, even although we clearly say that we do not share values, and we have a number of demands on reciprocity, level playing field, but we are offering a number of solutions, and this is resonating, even in areas as far away as Latin America, the Pacific area. And I think that, this shows that with all our problems, and sometimes even inconsistencies in the European Union, our model can still be very appealing. And on specific global issues, the European Union, and this is an experience from the field that I'm providing here, can have an impact on the foreign policy and can offer some solutions. Because in particular, the issue of China has created a lot of confusion here. The global conflict between the US and China in countries that have strong economic investment and even cultural links with China has created some disruptions. And the EU offers a model, and this has facilitated the way in which we engage with the region. So on limited number of global issues, I think that there is a European way.
Ambassador, thanks very much. Thanks for joining. Thank you for that perspective. For those of us who always worry about the strength of coherence of the EU, sitting here in Brussels, it's good to know that it looks positive and is developing a positive narrative, particularly in Latin America. Good to have you. Also, the panel will comment in a moment. Gianpaolo, you are the final one this evening. So please, very briefly, your comment or question.
Thank you very much. No, I have only a short comment about the issue of multilateralism from our perspective, that is a perspective of a developing NGO, because ABS is a developing NGO. In this pandemic, the multi-stakeholder approach has been confirmed and necessary and a must-have condition. For this reason, I think it's better to talk of multi-stakeholder approach and not multilateralism. Because the partnership among different subjects as a multilateral organization, European Union, civil society organization, NGOs, private sector, university, think tank, is the only workable path. And of course, if we want to work for and reach a durable and sustainable development. But this multi-stakeholder approach has two roles. One road is an horizontal alliance, I mean among all the local actors in the field. And the other one is a vertical partnership based on mutual listening and collaboration among the different kind of institutions.
Yep.
This is my comment on multilateralism, because if we talk only multilateralism, we cut a big part of the society,
Okay. Gianpaolo,
this
thank
is
you.
the point.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you for pointing that out. Appreciate that. The panelists, we're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to ask you in reverse order, beginning with Henry, just to give us in a sentence. I know it's a challenge, but you could do it in a sentence, not just any answers to those questions, but any concluding thoughts as well. So we'll start with Henry, then to Valerie, Joe, final word, but all of this has got to happen within a minute. So I'm counting on you, dear panelists. Henry.
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, the title of this section is that we can't walk it alone. You know, we have to work together. So I would propose that why can't we have a G10 summit on the climate changes, which the 6 largest emission countries that plus other countries work together. So that's one thing. And the other thing, I think China is now getting very hard debated now. But maybe we should have a trilateral meeting, have a US, EU, and China. And we can really have on a regular basis to see what are the differences, how can we sort it out. And because there is a difference between EU and China and US, so we can really have a 3-party talks or 3-party summit, and let's really strengthen the multilateralism at the UN system and WTO and all the WHO.
Henry, you took 3 sentences, but you gave us a very good idea for a G10 summit on climate change, and that's something that we could look at Friends of Europe and follow up. Henry, thank you. Valerie, your 1 sentence, please.
I think there is a huge fissure that we're seeing in terms of where the growth is in our world, in terms of the countries and continents with significant numbers of young people that are leading the way in terms of innovation, and those countries which have the greatest power in terms of our multilateral organization. So I think the major challenge for us is to think about how we bring those 2 things together, how we bridge that gap between the developed and developing world as we look to a future which is more about digitization, which is more about innovation, and how we help those developing countries to leapfrog some of the mistakes that have been made in the developed world.
Valerie, thank you very, very much indeed, and for that very clear strategic conclusion. And then Joe, we began with you, so it's appropriate that you have the final word.
1 sentence, we do need to rethink multilateralism, and that means understanding the role of network organizations as supplement to formal intergovernmental organizations. And those are citizen-oriented and make a huge difference. We're going to need more of them, both virtual and physical. And the other, if I can be permitted a 2nd sentence, Europe's narrative does provide it with soft power, and more power to it.
Joe, thanks very much. Well, the role of a moderator is normally to give a brilliant summing up, but as I've had 3 panelists this evening, I think they've done it better than I can. My conclusion from this is that multilateralism is necessary, but it's also alive and kicking, but maybe it's not in the places where traditionally, like summits of governments and meetings of great leaders, the places where we usually used to look for it, but it's elsewhere. It's in these new networks of citizens, of young people, of private sector, universities, the expert community, meeting up and trying to find practical solutions. And the panel have identified practical solutions tonight. I must admit, I've ended this conversation a lot more optimistic than when I started, and that's normally only the case in about 1 in every 100 webinars that I'm participating in at the moment. So for my mind, it's certainly been a good hour, and it's been the credit of our 3 panelists, Joe Nye, Valerie Amos, Henry Wang. Again, on behalf of Friends of Europe, an enormous thanks. Audience, those of you who asked the questions, those of you who didn't have time, but again, comments on chat. Thanks a lot for staying the course this evening, but it's been very much to your benefit as well. So that concludes this session. And now what I would like to tell you is don't go away, because the State of Europe Conference 2020 has one more event to offer to you, and I think you're going to find it very interesting. Here you go. It's We the People. What vision of Europe do citizens want? It's going to come up in just a few moments. My colleague Joe Joe is going to be the moderator. You'll see him come up very, very quickly. And it's going to give young people, and of course today we've been talking a lot about young people, the opportunity to do what they do very, very well, which is to grill the top decision makers on the future of Europe. What do we want? What do we, young citizens, well, I can't say we, I'm not in that category anymore, but what do the successor generation expect? What do they want? And how can they get answers to their questions? So Joe is going to be in the lead in taking that debate forward. It comes up in just a couple of moments, so please stay on because it will bring, I think, this State of Europe Conference 2020 to a very fitting conclusion. But from myself, Jamie Shea, here in Town Hall Europe, it's been a real pleasure, and let me now sign off. Stay safe and see you at the 2021 State of Europe Conference. And thanks again to Tonu for bringing it also to a nice fitting conclusion in a cartoon. Goodbye for now.